What I'm actually going to talk about today is a paper that I wrote for the Journal of Sports Sciences with a colleague of mine, Nikki Hodges from the University of British Columbia. It's only been out a couple of months or so, if that. And in the paper, what we do is we present a skill acquisition framework for excellence. In my mind, there's no doubt that the framework applies to pretty much all the various codes of volleyball. But I think it really applies across the board. So it's a generic framework that potentially may be helpful to coaches in considering some aspects around coaching practice. And one thing I will say, first and foremost, is that, coaching is an art form. And there's a lot of intuition and craft knowledge that goes into coaching. But clearly, there's no reason why that art can't be informed by the science. So what I'm going to do is talk around the science that exists around effective practice and instruction and talk about some of the potential implications as far as coaching practice is concerned. This particular paper actually built on a previous paper that Nikki Hodges and I wrote in 2005, where we looked at effective practice and instruction at challenging practice. It mainly focused on soccer, but we highlighted 5 potential myths that existed at that time between what the science of learning was saying and perhaps contemporary coaching behaviors at that time. And the first myth was that demonstrations are always effective in conveying information to the learner. That isn't the case. Sometimes they're effective, but other times they can convey no meaningful information. And sometimes they actually can have a negative impact on learning. Myth 2 was that specific blocked practice of a single skill is essential for skill learning. And again, whilst blocked repetitive practice is useful for short-term performance, its impact on learning is less clear. Augmented feedback from a coach should be frequent, detailed, and provided as soon as possible after the skill has been performed. That was also somewhat of a myth in regards to the fact that athletes need to be able to process their own feedback. So too much feedback can have a negative impact on learning. Prescriptive coaching is always better for skill acquisition than instructional approaches based on learning by guided discovery. And again, there's been increasing evidence over the last few decades about the benefits of less prescriptive, more hands-off approaches to instruction. And the final myth in that paper was that game intelligence skills are not amenable to practice and instruction. And obviously evidence suggests that they very much are. That is actually a topic of another talk that I've agreed to deliver for Jordan probably sometime in November. But in this new paper, what we wanted to do is to be a little bit more positive, and rather than highlight some myths, what we wanted to do is to present some action points and things that we think coaches need to be aware of. In some instances, I'm sure many coaches are already aware of many, if not all of these points. But again, I just want to highlight the science that underpins these. So action point 1 is to find the right balance between focusing on long-term learning and short-term performance. And in essence, it's very important here to differentiate between performance and learning. So when we take a practice session, whether we're working with kids or high-level athletes, what you actually see in that coaching session is their performance. It's observed behavior. Now, that is different from long-term learning. So in order to see that the change in performance that you see in practice translates into long-term learning, firstly, we have to make sure that that skill is retained into subsequent practice sessions. And secondly, we have to see that it transfers from one practice session to the next. And ideally, of course, the ultimate test of practice is that it transfers from practice to competition. So performance and learning are not the same things. And typically what happens actually when we engage in practice, there's a period of consolidation of memory traces laid down in memory. So therefore, most people would argue that before we can evaluate learning, there has to be at least a period of rest, ideally a period of sleep between observed practice and subsequent measures of retention and transfer. And that's probably why actually there's been increasing interest of late in using things like sleep pods with elite athletes, in that there's some evidence to suggest that even short naps, 10, 20 minutes, potentially may help this consolidation process and improve learning on task. So there are several reasons why the differentiation between learning and performance is important. And this is a classical instructional model. I mean, I guess as coaches, what we do is we convey information to the learner, often using demonstrations, verbal instruction. We then, of course, decide how we're going to provide an opportunity for athletes to practice those skills. So we can either do specific versus variable, blocked versus random practice. We could do small-sided games. We could do drill and grid-based practice, a whole range of ways that we can structure practice. And then normally, as a coach, we provide feedback in some shape or form, which can vary in regards to its precision, frequency, the manner in which we provide it, verbal, visual, video. And then underpinning this is our mode of instruction, our preferred method of coaching, whether we tend to be very hands-on and prescriptive in the coaching process or the extent to which we're a little bit more hands-off. So coming back to this differentiation between performance and learning then, why is it important? Well, if I as a coach want the best performance in that particular practice session, then what I should do is provide lots of instruction, demonstrate often, do specific blocked practice of a single skill, and provide feedback frequently and in detail. So those conditions generally produce the best short-term performance. But rather ironically, we have a little bit of a reversal phenomenon here, or a paradox, in the sense that virtually the reverse conditions tend to promote better long-term learning. So maybe the argument then as a coach should be, well, what is the least amount of instruction that I need to give to these athletes before they can begin to practice the skill? To what extent are my practice conditions random, variable, and dynamic, such that they reflect the demands of competition, not only technically, tactically, but also physically, physiologically, and mentally? So specificity of practice is a big element. And then finally, what's the least amount of feedback that I need to provide the athletes? How can I encourage the athletes to reflect on their own performance and self-correct through trial and error learning to a great degree? So success is not always what you see. I just picked this picture up off the internet the other day, and I love it. So if you look on the right-hand side, for instance, performance in practice may look great. And that might be benefited by the fact, I said, lots of instruction, lots of feedback, block practice. But then the question is, well, how much learning is actually taking place? Whereas in contrast, on the left-hand side here, performance may not look good in practice, but at the same time, you end up with a bigger carrot, so to speak, in the sense that potentially that may produce greater learning in the long case. So success is not always what you see, or if I flip it around, I always say, well, what you see in practice may not necessarily what you get as far as long-term performance is concerned. So that's something I think that coaches need to be constantly aware of. The other challenge, of course, is how do we measure performance? And, rather strangely, actually, in team sports like volleyball or soccer or basketball, performance is exceptionally hard to measure, in so much as you can take a very sort of black and white view of it. You either won or you lost. You scored more points than they did. But, invariably that isn't the case. And, unlike the 100-meter sprint or swimming or the javelin, the discus, where there is specific measures that related to performance, In team ball sports, we don't have that. We have certain metrics, perhaps, that may help us make some judgment on how we perform. But measuring performance is exceptionally difficult. And invariably, actually, what we do, well, I'll come back to this later, but let me also highlight the differentiation between performance effectiveness and performance efficiency. So performance effectiveness is the actual outcome. Was the player able to serve into the prescribed area requested? What does performance on the outside look accurate? Do they hit the goal? Do they put the golf ball into the hole? Whereas that's different from performance efficiency. So performance efficiency refers to the effort, mental or physical, for instance, that is invested into the task to achieve the desired outcome. And again, the reason why these two issues are worth differentiating is that sometimes you may not necessarily get an improvement in performance effectiveness, but what may be happening is that you get improvements in performance efficiency. So improvements in performance efficiency may be improved technical skill performance, reduced attention needed to perform the task, more consistency in performance, less effort generally invested in task performance. So again, whilst you may appear or it may appear outwardly that there's no improvement in performance effectiveness, doesn't necessarily mean that learning isn't occurring. It may well be that learning is manifest through changes in performance efficiency. So even measuring performance in itself is very difficult. And I've just put up a couple of performance profiles here. And I mean, of course, these could have pretty much any of them. The one in the bottom right here, these are probably some of the attributes that may be important in soccer, for instance. And of course, normally people try and measure these. But to illustrate my point, I guess, as a coach, what we actually do is that we rarely coach performance and we rarely measure performance. So what we might do, for instance, well, I want to work on this player's ability to dribble the ball. So then what I do is I design the coaching session to improve dribbling. And then, of course, you may improve performance in dribbling, but it doesn't mean that then leads to a change of performance in the match. So that's an interesting concept to grasp, actually. So we never actually coach performance. We can coach attributes of performance. And these are hard to measure. Severalfold. Not only do we not always get in practice what we see in learning, not always do a lack of changes in performance effectiveness not lead to learning, because there could be improvements in performance efficiency. So a whole range of things here around learning and how we measure it. And even these two charts here, the chart in the top left-hand corner looks at number of dribbles, number of passes, traditional metrics of performance. So again, to reiterate the point, these are not performance per se, they're just characteristics, subcomponents that may be related to successful performance. So action point 2 is to focus on the quality rather than merely the quantity of practice. And clearly there's a lot of work that's been done using the deliberate practice framework to map out the developmental history profiles of elite athletes. And we've done a lot of work. We've certainly got a lot of data in soccer, in cricket, and in skiing. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any data in volleyball, although I didn't do a search on it. But, these studies have typically looked at age of first engagement in the sport, typical hours of practice accumulated in the sport, whether they be coach-led or sort of non-coach-led play-related activity, beach volleyball or street volleyball, if you like, and the hours accumulated in other sports, for instance. And typically, we know that elite athletes accumulate massive numbers of hours in practice. But it's not just about the quantity, of course, it's also about the quality. And this is a nice graph that we adapted from one of Ericsson's papers. And on this vertical axis here, you have performance. And along the bottom, we have the amount of hours accumulated in practice. And then the curve here represents a typical learning curve. So clearly what we do initially is we normally have a very rapid initial improvement in performance. And then this then plateaus out. But there's still obviously some degree of improvement, but then the extent of the improvement diminishes. So it's called the law of diminishing returns as far as practice is concerned. And what Ericsson actually argued was that sub-elite or novice performers suffer from arrested development, okay, in that they plateau very soon. And the reason for this, he says, is they continue to engage in the same types of practice repetitively. So often, for instance, they spend a lot of time practicing things they're already good at. In contrast, experts, he said, tend to spend a lot more time practicing things they're not good at. And therefore, what you need to do is to identify the subcomponents of performance that you need to work on in practice in order to improve, which then allows you to subsequently continue to progress along that learning curve and avoid the onset of arrested development. So we don't want to spend too much time engaging in maintenance practice, for instance. We also want to spend a lot of time in what we might call growth training. At one point, it just dawned on me that I think I should probably mention in terms of the last section, of course, is that whilst I do suggest that typically the focus should be on long-term learning, I also acknowledge that there are some times where short-term performance may be important as well. An example, for instance, might be that if you have an important match tomorrow, then the amount of learning that's going to happen in that practice session that is going to impact on performance tomorrow is probably going to be quite small. So therefore, maybe the priority in that final session, is about performance. Because if performance is good, then self-confidence is high, so that you therefore go into competition feeling better. So, I'm not saying we exclusively focus on learning, but getting that balance right between when do we focus on performance and when do we focus on learning are probably equally important factors. And I think that same debate exists here as well. I'm not saying that maintenance training has no positive impact at all. What I'm saying is we need to get the right balance between what may be maintenance training, where we try and retain and maintain the skills that we have, and engaging in what we might call growth training. So there are sufficient opportunities for the learner to grow and develop new skills. So Ericsson actually differentiated between these different types of practice. So he suggested that on the left-hand side here, there is relatively low learning, whereas higher learning comes on the right-hand side. So things like maintenance practice, where the goal is to reinforce, very naive practice, where there are no clear goals and where learning is hopeful. Again, there may be some learning, but it's probably not substantive. Similarly with play, competition and match play, again, it doesn't suggest that learning doesn't occur, but it may well be that the level of learning that occurs is not optimal. So he therefore argued that practice that is deliberate, purposeful, and challenging, where the specific emphasis is on improving weaknesses, is where most of this growth occurs. And then subsequently, there have been a few people who have proposed some models that might be followed in the performance context. This is one by Ford and Coughlin. So it's called Aspire. I quite like it. So A is, you need to use as much data as you can, data analytics, to try and identify what components of performance need to be improved. You then need to select what are the goals for improvement based on this selection. Then, of course, you need to design appropriate practice so that there is the opportunity to engage in improving these skills. Evidence suggests that certainly feedback is important. Not all of that is coach-driven. Some of it can come from the athlete. Clearly, there is some element of repetition that's needed and some element of evaluation. And quite interesting, actually, I've just started work with a top golfer, and he's in the top 10 of the world. And it's fascinating the amount of data that is now available to PGA and presumably live golf professionals around each shot in things like ball trajectory, ball height, ball velocity, revolutions of the ball, and a range of different factors, and how they're using the data analytics now to try and specifically identify components of performance that they need to improve on. Coming down to which club is their strongest club, which is not their strongest club, and even how some of these shot selections are influenced by weather conditions. So there's a lot of data out there at the moment, although it's not always integrated into this kind of SPIRE model in terms of skill development. So invariably, quality of practice is exceptionally important. It's not just about the quantity. It's also about the quality. Action point 3 is that as coaches, we need to create practice conditions that are specific to competition. And I know there's a huge debate ongoing between the importance of specificity versus generalizability in the development of expertise. And I'm not saying that there is no transfer of skills across sports. However, the empirical evidence to substantiate what transfers, how it transfers, and what degree of engagement in the other sport is needed for transfer to occur is virtually non-existent. Okay, it's all intuitive, it's all anecdotal. I suspect, there probably is some transfer, and of course, the closer two sports are, then the more likely there is to be transfer. So I could easily see, for instance, that there is transfer between beach volleyball and court volleyball, because clearly, strategically, tactically, in other words, there are probably lots of similarities. But I doubt, whether the degree of transfer that generally occurs across sport is crucial in the development of expertise. Most of the evidence suggests that specificity is key. And that I think, the interesting question, what is specificity, first and foremost? Well, I think the argument is that the more it looks, feels like the game, so the more the psychological, physical, technical, tactical demands of match play are replicated and potentially exceeded in practice, then I think the better chance of learning occurring. This is, of course, a difficult balance, though, between repetition versus specificity. So I'll give you an example. I used to coach soccer a lot, so excuse if I'll use soccer, but I guess you guys should be able to pull some specific examples from volleyball. But let me give you an example. I mean, let's say I have a wide midfield player, and I'm concerned about his ability to make the right decision when he receives the ball out in wide areas. Then, okay, one way I can look at that is I can create a practice situation in a small grid or zone region where there might be, say, 3 attackers, 3 defenders. Plus point with that is that there's lots of repetition. The player's going to get the ball a lot of the time. But then the potential downside is, what's the level of specificity in the sense of the fact that, okay, well, he gets a lot of touches, but are those decisions he's making in that practice situation similar to the ones that he will make in a match? And of course, you can argue with there's some decisions that he can't make. Like he can't, for instance, decide that he's going to play a ball to the far post because I've restricted it into a zoned area. So there's other options, of course. So I can make the zone bigger. I can play 6v6. Or, of course, I can go to 11-sided 11v11 game and coach within that scenario. Positive with the 11v11 situation, of course, specificity is high. But then how often is that player going to get the ball in that position so that they have the opportunity to make a decision? So then, as a coach, how do you balance up this need to have repetition whilst at the same time having high levels of specificity? And for me, actually, maybe I might say that specificity is more important than repetition. Because if you're repeating something that doesn't feel like the game, so it doesn't have the same technical, tactical, psychological, emotional demands, then what are you actually practicing? And, just by way of example, there's now an increasing body of research that shows that when we're mentally fatigued or anxious or we're under high levels of physiological workload, then we actually process information very differently. So our search behaviors change. The way that we prioritize information changes. For instance, we're more likely to rely on sort of pickup of information from the postural movements of an opponent rather than picking up higher level cognitive factors based on strategy and tactics. Because, of course, they require more attention, and attention is being used up to cope with the anxiety. So therefore, when all these stressors impact on decision and technical performance to some degree, then what do we actually train when we practice without those stressors? Maybe we're practicing something totally different. So for me, specificity is probably far more important than repetition. I'm not saying repetition isn't important, but I'd rather have high specificity and low repetition than high repetition and low specificity. That would be my view on it. I was going to talk about VR briefly. This might be probably a topic that might be better in the next talk. But, one of the advantages of VR, of course, is we can recreate decision-making situations. The footage is filmed from a first-person perspective. I can put someone back into the game that they've just played, and they can experience the same types of decision-making again. So potential advantage of VR is high levels of repetition. But then, of course, the concern is, well, what's the level of specificity in the sense, or to what extent does it really look and feel like a game? But you can see, how potentially VR environments, as they continue to develop and become more match specific and realistic, provides a great environment for increasing repetition, whilst also maintaining some level of specificity. Action point 4 is to consider individual differences in how learners respond to various interventions. What I'll say probably somewhat of a negative fact, perhaps, as far as research over the last 30, 40 years, most of the research that we've done as scientists has been using groups of individuals and comparing one intervention to another with groups. Most of our conclusions are based on generally how does this group of individuals perform relative to that. We've often ignored actually some of the individual difference factors in this. And so this topic is becoming back a little bit more to the fore now. And perhaps these are arguably some of the more interesting questions at the moment around practice. One of the interesting bits is around how do we set the level of difficulty in practice? How do we create what others have termed challenge points or desirable difficulties? And Guardiola and Lee developed their challenge point framework. And this framework has been extended recently by Nicky Hodges and Keith Lowes in a paper in Journal of Sports Sciences again in 2000. So this is the original framework. So on the left-hand side here, we've got performance. So poor performance at the bottom, good performance at the top. And then at the bottom, we've got relative difficulty, low to high. And then on the right-hand side, learning, low to high. So clearly, if we want good performance, then probably difficulty would be low, but then learning may not be very high. So ultimately, what we need to decide is where do we set the bar, reflected by this grey dot here, where performance is sufficiently good such that learning is taking place, but it's not too easy. And we have the appropriate level of difficulty. And that's a big challenge. And this graph may illustrate it a little bit better, actually. So this comes from the recent paper. So again, on this left-hand side, we've got the individual challenge for the learner, low, high. We've got specificity to competition, low and high on the bottom. So therefore, probably we want to avoid situations which have a low challenge and low levels of specificity. Okay? And maybe at the other end of the extreme, we want to try and avoid situations which are extremely difficult and high in specificity, the avoid zone. Although I put that out there with a big question mark. And then maybe what we need to do is to try and find this growth zone. So the growth zone is one which is high in challenge and high in specificity. whereas low challenge and high specificity may be the maintenance. So I guess, the challenge is that if let's say I'm taking 12 players in a coaching session and I'm working on a particular theme, whatever that theme might be, then obviously there's a massive range potentially of individual differences between those players on that particular skill. So it may well be that some of those players are in the avoid zone, some of those players are in the growth zone, and some of the players are in the maintenance zone. And so that is extremely challenging, and it really highlights first and foremost perhaps the benefits of an individualized approach to training. Not only in terms of setting the level of difficulty of practice in an appropriate manner for each individual learner, but also going back to the previous point I made, which I think was point 3, around deliberate practice. Not every player has the same strengths or weaknesses. So therefore, if you've got 12, 16 players in the group, how many of them are actually working on strengths that they already have? So therefore, they're in the maintenance zone. Based on what you're practicing, not in terms of the level of difficulty what you're practicing. How many of those players are actually in the growth zone? In that not only are you practicing a skill that they need to work on and need to improve, but you're pitching the level of difficulty at the right level for that to happen. And of course, that's made exceptionally difficult if I go back to point 1. Why? Because what you see is not what you get. So therefore, performance and learning are very different. So again, you might be, well, he's performing very well, so by definition, he or she must be learning. Maybe not. Or performance is terrible, so there must be no learning going on. Maybe not. So it's something that you certainly have to evaluate over a period of time. And couple of points here, and I've been playing around with this a little bit recently, actually. Okay, let's say we want to improve the level of difficulty. So we think that we're working on a particular weakness for this one player, and we want to improve difficulty. So we've got options as coaches. So we can make it less difficult by providing less instruction. We can make it, more difficult by providing less instruction. We can make the practice more variable and dynamic, random. We can provide less feedback. We can significantly increase stress, whether that's mental fatigue, physiological fatigue, or anxiety. Or we could change the task requirements in terms of level of precision or accuracy needed in the task. And here's the interesting bit. Which one do we choose? Which one do we choose? How do we actually do that? How do we decide? How do we not only, there's 3 things to decide, therefore, that need a significant input, aren't they? What skills to work on? We can be data-driven in that regard, so that's probably less subjective. How do we measure task difficulty and the challenge for each individual? And how do we determine how we change that task difficulty? I think in future, actually, artificial intelligence may play a big part in this process, to be fair. We've started to potentially do some work with the military where we're using VR environments to train warfighters. And over a period of time, if you gather enough data where you manipulate instruction, variability, practice, feedback, stress, task constraints, the system begins to generate its own solutions to the issue. So when you have an individual learner who comes in, starts practicing in the simulated environment, the AI system will actually can make those judgments and will increase task difficulty proportionally over time. I don't think we're actually too far off that. How successful that would be, I don't know, but I think that probably will be the future to some degree. But I mean, clearly at the moment, we've probably got a lot of intuition that goes in from coaches. Coaches have got to decide, well, do I provide less instruction? Do I increase stress? Do I improve task constraints? And then, the other factor, what's the optimal success rate? Success be failure. And these may depend on a range of factors. Okay, so we haven't done enough work that begins to look at what I call aptitude treatment interactions. So these are things like, if I've got high levels of grit, for instance, or resilience or mental toughness, does that mean, I can cope better with failure? So therefore, I need really super challenging environments where I'm always on the cusp between success and failure. But then maybe if I'm low in confidence, and I'm going through battlefield and I don't, that's maybe I need to lower down a little bit. So, invariably there are lots of individual differences, personality factors here, if you like, that will also have a significant impact on how we find these challenge points and these levels of difficulty. Even also something like there's been a big growth recently in self-regulation of learning, and that is the fact that actually athletes themselves can choose when they want feedback or when they want instruction, or when they want to change some aspects of training. And actually some of these approaches have been very successful. There's increasing evidence in favor of more hands-off approaches to instruction. And this really takes me to action point 5, which is, I think as coaches, we need to facilitate learning during practice rather than dictate or abdicate. And, there's been increasing evidence now over 10 to 20 years that more hands-off approaches to instruction have a lot of benefits over overly prescriptive approaches. Overly prescriptive hands-on approaches to coaching potentially impose artificial constraints on learning, so that they may present a temporary and inefficient solution through good performance in practice and develop what we call routine expertise. So routine experts can solve most problems most of the time, but that's different from adaptive expertise, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Adaptive expertise is experts who can solve all problems all the time because they've learned to problem solve themselves. Skills that are learned through very prescriptive coaching methods are more likely to break down under pressure. The plus point with prescriptive coaching is that performance in practice is better, confidence is higher, but then the question is, is there transfer? And the evidence suggests that skills that are learned through guided discovery are more adaptable and unique, i.e. focusing on the development of adaptive expertise. Skills developed through guided discovery are more resistant to forgetting, less likely to break down under pressure. And the downside is, of course, is that performance is less efficient in the first instance. So learning may take longer. It's a longer journey, but that will produce better outcome. And there's been lots of papers published over the last few decades, of course, about the advantages of constraints-based approaches. And I quite like these models, not so much as a conceptual framework, perhaps, but more as a working framework, in the fact that, the challenge for coaches is to manipulate different constraints that then subsequently changes player behavior. And often in coaches, of course, these are things like conditioned games, rules, manipulating time and space, equipment use. These are the ones that coaches more often manipulate. There are some things that we can also manipulate: level of fatigue, workload, emotional components of fitness, probably, and even playing surface, playing conditions. So the argument is that what coaches need to do is manipulate these constraints within the demands of the game such that the player gets the opportunity to learn independently. And therefore the whole process becomes more hands-off. So that's not abdicating, by the way, and this is the problem with some of these constraints-based approaches, in that, it's hard as a coach to know what constraints to manipulate, and I think it requires high levels of craft knowledge and intuition. And I think the problem that you might get with inexperienced coaches is that they're more likely to abdicate, in the sense that they just might let players and the kids play, whereas really you need to have a significant high understanding of the sport to know what constraints to manipulate to cause certain types of behaviors. And to some degree, actually, I'm probably only advocating extensive use of the constraints-based approach with high-level players and high-level coaches. Because I think if you're working at the low level, then ultimately you're probably not trying to develop world-class volleyball players. You really want people to have fun and enjoyment. And maybe in that regard, being a bit more prescriptive and a bit more hands-on may be okay, because at the end of the day, you need the right players with the right coaches in the right environment to facilitate the level of progress that you want to have. Huge amount of work as well, of course, on external focus of attention, more implicit learning strategies. It all point pretty much to the same thing. The challenge of coaching is to provide the minimal amount of instruction needed so that the players can begin to learn independently. It doesn't mean that the role of coaches becomes redundant, far from it. It means you actually have to elevate your coaching so that you become more of a catalyst, and you have to facilitate change, not by abdicating or by being too prescriptive, but by providing the right amount of information at the right time to facilitate learning. So these are the action points for the skill acquisition framework for excellence. Find the right balance between the focus on performing and learning. At least be aware, if nothing else, of the difference between performance and learning. And maybe the relative importance of them, as I said, may vary from one session to the next, on what your particular emphasis is and what level of players you're working with. Really focus on the quality of practice. I think probably within that comes this concept of specificity. And ultimately, specificity needs to be high to match the demands of competition. That, for me, is crucial, much more important than quantity. And then, we need to consider individual differences. What are players' strengths and weaknesses? What does that mean in terms of the specific types of practice sessions that we need to develop? How do we take into account some of these aptitudes around grit, resilience, and mental toughness, and how does that influence how we shape the difficulty of the task? And then how can we do all that by not being overly prescriptive in the process to facilitate skill learning? So, it wasn't my intention, to be honest, to put a recipe forward. I don't think there is a recipe to coaching. As I said, genuinely, I think coaching is an art form. But what I've tried to do is probably just to illustrate where we're at in terms of the current science. And I think that the challenge is, how can we integrate the science into the craft? And I think there's probably a lot of scope for a lot of discussion amongst coaches, amongst each other, with players, with skill acquisition specialists to try and optimize what we actually do to facilitate training. And, I'm going to leave with a very final, interesting question. And that is, for every hour of practice, what is a reasonable level of transfer of that practice to competition? As I said before, immensely difficult to measure. And if I could measure it, I'd be sitting on the beach somewhere drinking pina coladas at this moment in time. It's probably worth a fortune, right? But do you know what? I think, let's assume we could measure it. What's a good scale? We'd all like to say 100%, wouldn't we? It'd be great if 100% what we do in practice transfers to competition. But I think if we could measure, we'd probably be disappointed. It may be low, it may be 10, 20% of every hour of practice actually leads to meaningful learning, because of some of the factors I've spoken about, differentiating between learning and performance. Taking into account the fact that you've usually got large groups of learners and they've all got individual strengths and weaknesses. So one person's growth training is another one's maintenance training. And do we get all of these questions right? I suppose what we could say optimistically is wherever we're at now, whether it's 30, 40, 50, 60%, I think probably the big question over the next decade will be, why can we increase that by 10%? So if I can move that needle from 50% of my training transfers from practice to competition rather than 40, then that's a big, meaningful inroad into skill development. And I think that's maybe where the edge might come more as we move forward in trying to enhance performance across a range of different sports, really.